Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second annual International eConference on Atheism. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, something to keep in mind is that GCRR is not interested in converting or deconverting anybody from any particular belief system. We are strictly an academic institution, and we seek to approach the discussion of God and suffering purely from a scholastic standpoint, whether that standpoint is theistic, atheistic, or something else entirely. Now, that's actually, in fact, one of the greatest things about GCRR is that you're being joined by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world with a whole bunch of different backgrounds and traditions, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. Also, as a special gift to everybody, all you have to do is go to gcrr.org, our website, and look up our newest publication called God and Horrendous Suffering. And with that, all you have to do is scroll down to the bottom, and you can download a special sneak preview of the book by clicking the preview button. And if you end up wanting to purchase that book, we do recommend that you go through the GCRR website because our prices are a lot lower. But also, we're going to give you 15% off more than on the retail price. All you have to do is use the promo code SUFFERING, and that's all in lowercase. Use the promo code SUFFERING at checkout. And with that said, I'd like to introduce you to my very good friend and our next presenter, Mr. Dale O'Neill, and allow me to share my screen so I can give a proper introduction. Now, Mr. O'Neill is going to talk about the making and unmaking of a Christian zealot and beyond. Dr. O'Neill is a writer and a clinical psychologist with a private practice in Orange County, California. He is a former evangelical minister who left the ministry and Christianity over 40 years ago. And about a year ago, he wrote an essay on his journey titled The Making and Unmaking of a Christian Zealot, which is the final chapter in that anthology I was just talking about, God and Horrendous Suffering. Dale, thank you so much for being here and doing this. I'm so excited for this presentation. I will turn it over to you. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Darren. And thank you, Darren, for inviting me to share in this wonderful weekend. And thank you, John Loftus, for including that essay in your wonderful anthology, which I hope all of you will take advantage of and saving 15%. You can't beat that. By ordering it through this organization. First of all, today, I want to tell you why I wrote this essay and why I'm presenting it here today. Darren mentioned that I left Christianity about 40 years ago, and when I did, I never looked back. I just left and I said, I'm out of here. I can still remember leaving the church that I was a part of, practically skipping down the stairs on the evening of my, what do they call that when you're leaving your bon voyage or something like that. But over the last few years, I've come to see that my somewhat abandonment of my entire tribe that I grew up with, that's not okay. And for many reasons, I came to see that my journey is worth being shared in the hopes that it will be helpful to others who are on a similar journey and who maybe don't have the experience of someone like myself to look at. Because when I left 40 some years ago, I didn't know a John Loftus. I didn't know a Valerie Tirico. Bart Ehrman hadn't written all of his wonderful books. I didn't know of an Ed Babinski, of a Dan Barker. I think I mentioned Valerie Tirico. When I left, it felt like I was completely alone. And so I really applaud Darren and this religious trauma study that he is shepherding here. What a terrific thing to bring to people, the many people who are leaving their religious traditions. The Freedom from Religion Foundation has the Clergy Project for ministers who have been set adrift or who have cut the ties with their church. But obviously, religious trauma is far bigger than just ministers who no longer believe what they have to preach in order to be a part of that. It was clear to me that I had to leave because I no longer could support the doctrines of the church that I was a part of. So I want to share with you some of the inspirational comments that some great humanists that I have read, how they inspired me and prodded me and encouraged me in taking this journey. And I'm going to bring up a share here and hope we're going to be able to have you see this as well. All right, do we do it?
You got it.
All right. The first one's from Teilhard de Chardin, a French philosopher, Jesuit, and I love this. The individual has not the right to remain inactive. That is to say, not to seek to develop himself, herself to his fullest extent, because upon his individual perfection depends the perfection of all his fellows. I love that sentence. Upon my individual perfection depends the perfection of all of you, and your development affects mine. The absolute duty of the individual is to develop his own personality. If each of us can believe that he is working so that the universe may be raised in him and through him to a higher level, then a new spring of energy will well forth in the heart of Earth's workers. The whole great human organism will draw its breath and press on with strength renewed. I love that. And then one from Einstein. We think ourselves separate rather than part of the whole. This imprisons our affection to those few nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle to embrace all living creatures. Nobody achieves this completely, but the striving itself is part of the liberation. The next one, no one knows who wrote this, but boy, is it inspirational. The measure of individuals as well as nations is how the strong treat the weak. And the last one is one that I tell myself every morning from Rainer Maria Rilke. Now, beyond your own life, build the great arch of unimagined bridges. And every morning when I wake up in the morning, I go, Dale, let's go build some bridges. All right. I wish I could see your faces when I read those, because I just have to believe they're inspiring to you as well. Okay. To start our conversation, I want to put on my psychologist hat for a moment and look at a critical brain function that plays an enormous role in becoming a Christian zealot or any kind of a zealot, political zealot, any zealot. And yet this function is largely unknown. So I'm going to pop the brain diagram up here, and I'm going to get my little spotlight. Isn't that cool? And we're going to look at, except I've got to get that a little smaller. 1 second. Okay, I gotta minimize this thing. Um,
Minimize what, Dale?
Make the picture, the brain smaller.
I see a button up there that looks like an hourglass with the minus sign in it. Will that do it?
Yeah, let's see if I can get out of this. Well, we're gonna go with what we've got here.
If it helps, I can see the majority of that brain.
Okay, we're going to talk about the amygdala and the frontal cortex. The amygdala. Well, let's start with the frontal cortex. The frontal cortex is your decision maker. It's the part of the brain that holds your values, social skills, your identity, things that really matter. The amygdala, it's designed to protect you, to keep you alive. And it also is connected very much to the frontal cortex. So these two talk a lot to each other. So when you are threatened, the amygdala immediately responds. And I'm going to use the example of road rage. When you get a stimulus from outside, it first of all comes into the amygdala, and it takes twice as long for it to get into the frontal cortex. But something else happens. When the amygdala is stirred, if I were to jump out at you suddenly, you would get a shot of adrenaline. And how do you feel when you get a shot of adrenaline? Well, you feel tense, ready to react, focused. Well, what's actually going on in the brain is the adrenaline is actually blocking access to your frontal cortex because it doesn't want you to think, it wants you to react. And this is why people will say and do crazy stuff when they're threatened. Things they would never say and do if they were thinking about it. Now, road rage, of course, is the simplest example, but the same thing happens when you get into a spat with your spouse. The adrenaline fires, access to the frontal cortex is blocked, and you say and do things you would never say and do if you were thinking about it. Well, the same thing happens when your identity is threatened. The adrenaline blocks access. It doesn't want you to think, it wants you to react. And so once you begin reacting, the frontal cortex, which isn't blocked entirely, marshals all of its power to fend off that attack. And this, at least in terms of when the identity is threatened, every answer, every tool you have in your arsenal is used to protect from this invading, sometimes a thought, person, whatever. Now, this is a very critical function that is not widely known. I was fascinated with the book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. And I thought for sure he's going to identify this process. Well, in this wonderful book, he only mentioned the amygdala on 2 pages and never mentioned the adrenaline factor, which I just think is huge. And once people understand this dynamic, boy, it makes a difference. All right, well, continuing on to the brain function. When your car overheats, what do? You pull off the side of the road. So in a healthy, functioning person, when you recognize, oh my God, I am getting overheated here, you take a time out, a pause, or the pause that refreshes, we call it. Just say, hey, I'm not in a good spot here. I've got to calm down. Well, when your identity is threatened, you generally don't do that step because the adrenaline doesn't want you to do that. Oh, I forgot to mention something. We call the amygdala the chicken little of the brain. And Chicken Little, of course, always saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling. So the amygdala is always going to make it seem like the end of the world is near if this threat is allowed to penetrate. And also, very importantly, Chicken Little does not care about your happiness. So if you are fretting 24/7 about what could go wrong tonight, tomorrow, or a year from tomorrow, or about whatever this threat is, and you're miserable, Chicken Little goes, I don't care. It's not my job. My job is to make this person focus on the danger 24/7, which is obviously, from the standpoint of a psychologist, that is where anxiety is often located, is where there's just constantly listening to Chicken Little. Yesterday, I decided to have a little fun with this presentation and just sat down and jotted a few threats that came to my mind that are designed to activate the amygdala and block access to the frontal cortex. Some people call these dog whistles, but here's about 10 of them I came up with in 5 minutes. 1 second here. When I was growing up in the 50s, it was the communists are coming. The godless communists are coming, and they're going to take over our government and take away our freedoms. There's a war on Christmas. The Bible is full of errors. They're taking God out of the public schools. We no longer can have Bible reading and prayer. They're taking God out of our public meetings. We aren't able to open them in prayer. They're going to take away your guns. Immigrants are going to take away your jobs. Oh, here's a good one. Watch out for the homosexual agenda. Oh my God, they're going to have death panels. They're all for killing babies. They want to defund the police. They want to take away your freedoms. And I'll let you keep in mind what that might be about. And then the big one, well, if this was an open, if we all could talk, I think you probably would all get this one. The election was stolen. Anyhow, all of those are designed to block access to the frontal cortex and get you so rattled that you use all your resources to defend. Okay. Before we move on, I want to bring back, hold on. Can you see that one?
Nope. Don't forget to hit that share screen button on the.
Okay. Sorry. Okay.
Now we got it.
All right. Warnings from the past. These are statements from past people who recognized the dangers that humans are very susceptible to. And I want to read these. They are sobering. And then I want to get on to about my process of leaving Christianity. This is from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Probably most of you know Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran minister who was leading a conspiracy to assassinate Hitler, an amazing writer, and he was captured shortly before the liberation and was killed. But anyhow, this is something he came up with. In conversation with him, he's talking about the blinded person. One virtually feels one is dealing not at all with a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him. He is under a spell, blinded, misused, and abused in his very being. Having thus become a mindless tool, the stupid, now I decided he translated stupid, and I thought, okay, that was just a little hard for me. I just went with blinded person, but the actual German word is stupid or foolish. The blinded person will also be capable of any evil, and at the same time incapable of seeing that it is evil. And then some choice ones from Adolf Hitler. I use emotion for the many and reason for the few. Tell a lie loud enough and long enough, and people will believe it. What luck for rulers that men do not think. And then these two are in the chapter on the unmaking of a Christian zealot. Men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from religious conviction. And then the last one, bolded. This one just, I've sent this one to many news organizations. From Voltaire, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Okay, I'm going to move on to my story now. And I want to frame this whole story with the words of a Stanford researcher, a neurobiologist named Robert Sapolsky, that you can't reason somebody out of something they weren't reasoned to in the first place. And my essay, in a very large sense, is that's sort of a meta theme of that essay. Okay. I was almost 30 when I began to suspect the core of my Christian faith, which was salvation requires a human sacrifice, that was an invention of humans, not God. However, like so many Christians, particularly those born into the faith, I had given very little thought to the gruesome physical and emotional reality a human sacrifice entailed. Raw terror for the victim, the executioner, and the observer. Believe it or not, it never occurred to me to ask what kind of a being, human or divine, would get so angry at his child's disobedience that he would require that child to kill one of his own to regain his favor. Even more confounding was why so many gods came up with the same reprehensible idea. It was practiced in almost all ancient societies, even in different hemispheres. This skepticism about human sacrifice led me to question two other disturbing pillars of my faith, which, along with human sacrifice, I now see as the most hideous ideas ever conceived by humans: eternal punishment and genocide. All three are found in Christianity and Judaism, and the last two in Islam. Well, my Christian education taught me, my frontal cortex, that when I was threatened with this idea and this revulsion at these ideas, that these practices were justified by the rebellion of humans against God. I now see, in hindsight, my convictions weren't based on critical thinking, but my identity as a Christian. But before getting into that, a little historical context will be helpful. I attended a small Christian college in Santa Barbara named Westmont, excuse me, after which I went to Talbot School of Theology in La Mirada. There I received a Master of Divinity degree and was chosen Preacher of the Year. Also noteworthy is my father was Dean of Talbot for many years. After seminary, I served as an associate minister for about 5 years, at which time I also began my graduate work in psychology. Eventually, I got my doctorate in psychology, became a psychologist in private practice. And then a curious little thing that happened before I was leaving the church, I wrote a book called Meet the Man from Nazareth, which was published in 1972 by Zondervan Press, which was at the time, the largest Christian publisher there was. It was basically a paean to Jesus the man as presented in the New Testament. Not surprisingly, ever since leaving Christianity, that book has dogged me everywhere I go. Okay, the dawn of doubt for me began with a soul-rattling dilemma at age 28, which challenged not my Christian identity, but my identity as a human being. And importantly, this was an emotional dilemma, not an intellectual one. Kind of going back to that Robert Sapolsky quote, you can't reason somebody out of what they weren't reasoning into in the first place. Anyhow, here was the dilemma. My wife and I were contemplating having a baby. The possibility occurred to us, what if our child failed to accept the sacrifice of Jesus as his or her own? Haunting us was that familiar verse in the Gospel of John, he who does not believe in Jesus has been judged already because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. We realized that bringing a child into this world would place that child at risk of eternal punishment. How could we do that? For that matter, how could any Christian couple put their child in such jeopardy? After all, there are countless examples of children of devout Christian parents who don't become Christians, or worse yet, leave the faith, as was the case in my family, where 4 out of my parents' 5 children left. Now, a remarkable side note to this dilemma was neither of us had ever heard this issue ever mentioned in all our years in the church. And I went to seminary, for God's sakes. It never came up. And some of you who have read this essay have told me the same thing. It never was mentioned. All right, how I became a zealot. To begin, let's return to the brain discussion. Critical thinking is done by the frontal cortex, which is the last part of the brain to develop. One's identity is certainly held in the frontal cortex, but it is bound to and closely guarded by the amygdala. The job of the amygdala is to ensure one's physical and emotional survival, of which one's identity is a major part. So when one's identity is threatened, one's ego, gender, family, race, caste, religion, political affiliation, the amygdala signals the adrenal glands to secrete adrenaline into the bloodstream, where the mind and body now become focused on fight or flight. To aid in this escape, the adrenaline impedes or even blocks access to the frontal cortex because, as we said earlier, it wants the threatened person to react, not think. The amygdala connects with the frontal cortex and marshals a host of answers to the threat, particularly with identity, which satisfy true believers, but rarely anyone else. Now, here's a real good one. The final answer that protects a true believer from any penetration of their protective shield. It satisfies the true believer, but rarely anyone else. And this is the subjective authentication of one's faith. That believer knows his faith is true because it feels true. When combined with the other answers, this answer is a protective shield no rational argument can penetrate. All right, my path to becoming a Christian zealot. We're going to start with imprinting. I always say I wasn't a born-again Christian, I was born Christian. There was no leap of faith in my faith because I never doubted. My faith was an identity I was born with, which distinguished me from Jews, Muslims, even Roman Catholics. I was a Christian. And this is the primary path to faith for most people because of this powerful force known as imprinting. Newborns pattern their behavior and thinking after those around them. And I love what Richard Dawkins said about this. He said, how thoughtful of God to arrange matters so that wherever you happen to be born, the local religion always turns out to be the true one. This is also reminiscent of that classic definition of a cult, someone else's religion. Okay, although most are imprinted into their faith by birth, some get there by a conversion. And most converts are not converted because they find the evidence for the truth compelling, meaning by reason. Far more often, they report experiencing a divine presence, that the presence enters them and fills them with new power, clarity, and purpose. And in Christianity, this is commonly called being born again. And just like actual childbirth, the bonding hormone oxytocin is released, which binds new believers to their faith and to their faith community. Okay, that's imprinting. The next thing that binds and brings about Christian zealots is the subjective authentication of one's faith. Whether the path to faith is by imprinting or grafting, virtually all religions claim a subjective experience which authenticates the truth of their faith. So the ultimate assurance of the truth of their faith comes from a feeling it is true. I know in my heart it is true. And then, of course, critical thinking comes in to confirm what the heart already knows. In his classic book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, William James observed that conversion experiences are essentially identical in all religions. Of course, they all cannot be true. Now, here are some things the Bible tells you about your subjective authentication of its truth. In Romans 8, it says, the Spirit, meaning the Holy Spirit itself, bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. 1,000 times over, I belted out the gospel hymn, He lives. And here are the words. You ask me how I know He lives. He lives within my heart. Now, here's well-known Christian scholar William Craig, who was a professor at Talbot Seminary, where I graduated, and actually a teacher that John Loftus studied under. He tells us that the way we know Christianity is true is by the self-authenticating witness of God's Spirit. And he goes so far as to claim this experience is so immediate, unmistakable, that it rises to, and this is an unbelievable expression, it rises to the level of objective knowledge. Objective knowledge. One is incredulous that a scholar of Craig's stature could be unaware or ignore the devotees of every religion say the same thing. As mentioned above, knowing one's faith is true is the final protective barrier which insulates the faithful from challenges to their core identity. The main point is that for the vast majority, faith is more a matter of identity reinforced by culture, feelings, specious answers, than a decision arrived at by critical thinking. And this is where the words of Robert Sapolsky come in. You can't reason people out of something they weren't reasoned into in the first place. No intellectual argument can compete with, I am a Muslim, Hindu, Jew, Christian, or I know in my heart it is true. I know this because I was a poster child for I'm a Christian, I just know it's true. Here's Charles Darwin on this kind of certainty in The Descent of Man. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. Let me say that one again. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. And sadly, I identify with the words told to me by psychologist and former evangelical Valerie Tirico. I just know in my heart how wrong can feel so right. All right, so we've looked at imprinting. We've looked at the subjective authentication of one's faith. The next big area is groupthink. Once faith and identity are fused, this fusion is typically reinforced by a social phenomenon known as groupthink, which is a toxic byproduct of the desire for people to associate with others who are like themselves. Birds of a feather flock together. With groupthink, dissent is discouraged in favor of conformity. Alternative viewpoints are suppressed. And frequently, the group isolates itself from outside influences. Typically, group members are more concerned about group acceptance and cohesion than critical thinking. So reservations go unexpressed. And the result is a unanimous, but often flawed decision. The Bay of Pigs fiasco is a classic example of this. The power of groupthink is captured poignantly over 200 years ago by Thomas Paine. And I'm going to read this one twice. If you aren't familiar with this observation, it's powerful. The long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it the superficial appearance of being right. Time makes more converts than reason. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it the superficial appearance of being right. Time makes more converts than reason. Like inbreeding, groupthink thrives in isolation. In my case, I was the son of a minister in the Grace Brethren Church. It was an evangelical denomination whose motto was the Bible, the whole Bible, and nothing but the Bible, which translated into Christians, only Christians, and nothing but Christians. Christian was something you just were. And as faithful servants in waiting, our primary task was to warn as many people as possible of their impending doom if they failed to accept Jesus as their Savior before it was too late, meaning before they died, which we cautioned could be sudden, or before Jesus returned, which also could be sudden. All right, the next influence on becoming a zealot is gaslighting. And this is a term that is being used a lot more in, in political worlds. And I think it's going to become more and more familiar because it is just powerful. And we see it in the church and we see it in the Bible. And I'm going to read the definition of what it is, and then I'm going to show how the Bible plays into gaslighting. And gaslighting is a factor where it creates doubt in one's rationality. It's a form of psychological manipulation that makes people doubt their intelligence, memory, perception, and sanity. And it seeks to undermine trust in one's own mind and instead rely on the judgment of someone else, usually an authority figure who seeks to control the individual or group. I'm just going to say it again. Never before has it been so important for people to know what gaslighting is and how the natural function of their brains make them vulnerable to its siren call. I'm going to read a couple passages from the Bible, and I'm going to skip a couple of them too. You'll find these if you get the book in that last chapter. The most frequently cited gaslighting passage is Proverbs 3:5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding. This is second only to Isaiah 55, where it says, my thoughts, meaning the Lord's thoughts, are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours, and my thoughts than your thoughts. In the New Testament, Jesus says, thou didst hide these things from the wise and the intelligent, meaning the people who are listening to this presentation, and you didst reveal them to babes. The Apostle Paul, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent. I will frustrate. Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar, the philosopher of this age? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of this world? For the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom. And if you complain about that's not fair, Paul says in Romans, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? The thing molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me like this, will it? Okay. Well, the objective of gaslighting, and Paul's gaslighting, was to generate sufficient mistrust in his readers' rationality so they would consider a possibility they would otherwise have considered foolish. Namely, that Jesus' death on the cross, a human sacrifice, was essential for their salvation. And if you thought that was foolish, he would say that, well, you just don't understand. You're too wise. You're intelligent. And God has made the wisdom of the wise and scholars, he made them the real fools. All right, we call that gaslighting 1. Gaslighting 2.0, I'm going to I'm going to go to gaslighting 3 because that's the one that is just so scary. Gaslighting 3 is the most disturbing stage of all. This occurs when believers, and I'm going to add devotees of demagogues, are so certain of their convictions, they condone, justify, and may even commit acts of violence in service of them. And here that chilling word, those words of Voltaire come in. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. The next impact on becoming a zealot is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias was first identified by psychologist Leon Festinger in 1957, which he labeled cognitive dissonance. He found that when most people are confronted with evidence that contradicts their convictions, instead of modifying their beliefs and holding them less strongly, rather than face the pain of admitting they are wrong, they double down. And the more they have invested in the false beliefs, the more they will respond to contrary evidence by intensifying their attachment to those untrue notions. And here, economist John Kenneth Galbraith just says it so beautifully. Faced with the choice between changing one's mind and proving there is no need to do so, almost everyone gets busy on the proof. When you point out the evidence to the contrary of someone's deeply held belief, how often do you get, you know what, you're right, I think I need to rethink that. Or, wow, good point. I hadn't thought about that. I need to be a little less certain on that. Or making it a little more personal, how often does your spouse hear, you know, honey, you're right. My tone wasn't so great on that. Or, sweetie, you know, I need you to do better on that. That wasn't fair. I'm glad you pointed that out. So, macro, micro. When one's entire social network doubles down, it's a formidable reinforcement of the faith and a major disincentive to doubt and dissent. This is where the desensitization process kicks in and the faithful begin to tolerate specious explanations, habituate, in the religious sense, habituate to the demand for human sacrifice, where it doesn't bother them that much anymore. The double down tolerates poor explanations where they just become where they become okay. And I'm going to just mention some popular double downs. We aren't going to go into them in great depth. One of them, Mark Karras, in his presentation on petitionary prayer, mentioned this. And this is where in prayer, you count the hits and ignore the misses. And so every time what you pray for gets answered, that becomes a hit, and then you ignore the misses. But that tends to reinforce your belief. Another way you selectively attribute is you praise believers and you demean unbelievers. Some excellent verses which show how in the particularly the New Testament, where it says, if any man is willing to do God's will, he'll know whether it is of God or whether I speak for myself. So if you're not a Christian, what that means is you're not willing to do God's will. You're stubborn. And of course, that's used widely when people refuse to come to Jesus. Okay, learning answers is another way that we fight off counters to our faith. And I want to go to the problem of absolute certainty. Absolute certainty, which is often the result of people becoming zealots, is absolutely polarizing. In this case, people of belief know they are right and everyone else is wrong. So technically, they really aren't people of faith, because faith, by definition, contains a measure of uncertainty. The rupture in the human family and in our nation will not be healed by people of belief, but people of faith who respect and seek to learn from people of other faiths and other beliefs and other political persuasions. Because people of faith and people of reason appreciate that uncertainty is at the heart of the human experience. And even if they affirm an intelligent designer, uncertainty is at the core of that design. And I offer three maxims that capture this design of uncertainty. The first one is absolute truth may exist, and you may even possess it, but you cannot know that absolutely. The second one is God may exist, and he or she may even be yours, but you cannot know that absolutely. And the third is absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, but absence of certainty. I want to show you, before I wrap it up here, the third force that fell on me is actually the Sumerian tree of life that fell on me in the seminary library. And I want to share that if I can. Take a look at that. When I was struggling with what possible source could be there for eternal, for human sacrifice, I was searching ancient religions, ancient beliefs, and I was sitting on the very floor of the seminary library, and there was I think about a 10-volume set called The Mythology of All Races. And as far as we know, Sumeria is the oldest written languages. And so I think text number 7 was Sumeria. So I opened it up sitting on the floor, and I came to this page and this figure. And my jaw dropped, because this is about 1,000 years before the earliest dating possible of the Hebrews and Moses. So this figure was on a Sumerian seal about 2500 BC. Do you see anything familiar in that? I'm giving you a moment just to look at that. Does this look familiar? It's a goddess, the tree of life. Dates, a god with probably something along a crescent moon down here. And you notice that the scene is not one of temptation. It's not one of fear. It's one where the goddess and the king or consort, the tree of life, is there being freely offered. They're offering this gift of life, no temptation, no fear. But of course, the biggest thing here is the snake, the serpent, coiling up behind the woman. Well, I saw that and it just floored me, because I just knew at that moment that the story in the Bible was borrowed. And that began a journey for me that has led to a study that I'm with my co-author. I've been exploring and looking further back into these ancient civilizations, and particularly the goddess civilizations, and finding that there is so much there out of which Judaism and Christianity emerged. And so I close my essay with saying, that's a story for another time. But now I'm saying that other time is just about here. My co-author and I are finishing the edits on a book called Connecting the Drops, and how the Stone Age goddess gave birth to Judaism and Christianity. So if you follow me on Twitter, Dale O'Neill 19, we'll keep you apprised of how that's going, since we're in a place where soon we're going to be submitting it to publishers. And by the way, we did, my wife and I did have, we've actually had 2 children, and we happily were fear-free as we brought them into the world. And I think for that, I'm going to close. And thank you very much for listening to this. I hope it's been provocative, engaging, and helpful. And I'm very, very appreciative of the opportunity to share it with you. So I will turn that back over to Darren.
Wonderful. Thank you. I didn't actually expect such an abrupt ending. This was wonderful. Dale, thank you.
I noticed the time.
No, this is great. Yeah. I have a number of comments and questions. And actually, when you had brought up the Sumerian tree of life, I actually just started immersing myself in, I have a ton of books on ancient Near Eastern stuff. And part of one of the courses I teach is on some of the iconography like this. So I was starting to just immerse myself back in some of the literature, which is so much fun that you're doing this. Let me ask real quick. Was there one element? I realize that no deconversion is such an isolated incident that one thing causes you to leave the church necessarily. But if you had to pinpoint a single biggest thing that caused you to go, I'm done. It's BS. Or maybe an incident that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Can you identify one?
Well, I tried to identify that in referring to my seminary experiences. The Sumerian tree of life fell on my head. That was the coup de grace. My process in even looking at that volume was still being a part of the Christian belief and trying to find some way to make sense of it. And when I saw that image, it was, Dale, you have bought the Brooklyn Bridge. It was like the tree fell on top of me. It was that dramatic.
Do you think that I presume that there were enough doubts, enough stuff that was already accumulating in order for this to be such a blow. Do you think it would have been such a blow had you not already been questioning and doubting so many things prior to it, that you would have rationalized it away fairly early on, maybe in the faith?
Great question, Darren. In seminary, you never heard of any of this Sumerian icons. It was completely foreign. And so as I was struggling with some of these moral dilemmas, it was certainly opening the door to questioning the whole thing. But I was pretty committed to, okay, this is true. And, you learn all the answers. But that huge moral dilemma of human sacrifice, eternal punishment, and then that having it come right down to your own family of as I mentioned, a debate of having a child or not, you just had this feeling of something is horribly wrong here. And then to have something, the intellectual clobber confirming that, it just was, William James calls it a counter conversion experience. And it was like that.
Wow. I wanted to share just a personal thing to relate because it leads into a question. I myself was a Baptist minister for many years and had trained under Gary Habermas for apologetics.
Oh boy, yeah.
And one of the things in my doctoral program that I was astounded with was the constant overtness of a confirmation bias. And at one point, I remember even asking Dr. Habermas, it seems like we're engaging in a confirmation bias here. It seems like we minimize anything that counters our belief system, and we either ignore it or rationalize it away. And of course, when we elevate anything that might possibly be proof for our faith, and the response I got was, yeah, but they do it too. There wasn't a denying, there was very much an embrace of it. And the other thing that I found was very interesting was that these really famous apologists, William Lane Craig, Lee Strobel, Gary Habermas, others, were already converted, believers, established believers, long before they engaged in the apologetic enterprise. In other words, they had come to the belief first and then went out and seeking the evidence to prove the belief.
Right.
I found that so shocking because in my own conversion experience, I didn't grow up a believer. I wasn't exposed to it. I converted as an adult and then, of course, later deconverted. So one question I have for you, one of the things that Dr. Habermas would say a lot, he says, I've never encountered a counter-apologist like you or somebody who has fallen away from the faith who didn't fall away from it for emotional reasons. It's almost never based off of reason, logic, or something cerebral and cognitive. What do you have to say to that?
Oh, I love that. Well, you are so well, when you go into your graduate programs, a good graduate program, education, you go to a school like you and I went to, you go there to get your questions answered. A good graduate school, you go there to get your answers questioned. And so you go there, at least the apologetics, the way it's come now, there is such a absolute embrace where doubt is just not a part of the conversation at all. I never hear anyone say anything about uncertainty. It is thus saith the Lord. And so you're so defended that if someone like the Sapolsky comment comes in, if reason and defense is there, you're satisfied with specious answers. When you read Lee Strobel, when you read these goofball, the case for faith, and I can't believe they would convince a kindergartner. They are so specious. When you read Josh McDowell, by the way, Josh was in the class ahead of me at Talbot. And it's embarrassing, but people buy these specious explanations because it's their identity. And so, Darren, my experience is it took emotions to crack my protective shield. And once the emotions cracked it, then I was open to see the intellectual, the faulty superstructure that is just, it's just everywhere. And probably most visible in the defense of the resurrection. The resurrection rests on such flimsy evidence, and yet they treat it like it's the most solid historical fact in the history of civilization. Well, you can't do that unless you have an a priori conviction that it happened. And so Dr. Habermas, maybe he's never been bothered by hell or human sacrifice. And he's happy with his answer. But I think for most people, the wedge that opens them up is emotional. But then once that opens, probably just like you, Darren, you see a host of fallacies and poor thinking that you just cannot believe intelligent people, like that quote I gave from William Craig, that your subjective experience is so powerful, it rises to the level of objective experience. You go, that's crazy. And yet, with groupthink, I'm sure zillions of people would affirm that. Well, not zillions, but a lot.
Right.
Anyhow, so that'd be my response.
It's interesting. It's almost as if it's a mirror reverse of the conversion experience itself. That it is to convert to a religion oftentimes is a very powerful emotional subjective experience. And then you go looking kind of, you feel like your mind has been opened up to new realities. And the same thing, there might be doubts, there might be questions already there. You'd notice some of the discrepancies and inconsistencies, but you can somehow rationalize it away until the emotional hits.
Yes.
That are just irreconcilable.
Right.
And it's almost like a brand new opening again. Mirror reverse of it's a spiritual deconversion, if you will.
Yeah. Which is why I like William James' term, a counter conversion.
That's right. That's it.
You have the same experience of being converted to as being converted away from.
Yes.
And that was liberating. I shared that. I remember I shared it with my youngest sister and said, listen to this description. And she pauses and says, that's unbelievable. That's exactly what it is. Mm-hmm. And you're liberated. At least for me, it was, I felt shackled and then I felt liberated.
Interesting. I want to return to some of that, but I also want to open it up to the rest of the
okay.
You are, everybody in attendance, you are free to either raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself. If you have any questions or comments for our presenter, please speak up. Well, let me kind of fill in some of the space here. I think for me, a ton of doubt, especially as a theologian, as a wannabe apologist, I was encountering, I felt almost like it was my job to find the discrepancies and consistencies. And of course, try and smooth them over, try and figure out an answer to this. But for me, the thing that really kind of stuck was I could not understand, having been in ministry and seeing it firsthand, I couldn't understand why the people of God, the very people, and of course, speaking from my faith tradition, Christianity and evangelicalism, we claimed to have the living God living inside of us. And yet we acted no better than the rest of the world. In fact, oftentimes, and I really saw such a stark contrast when I finally left and I was embraced by the atheist or the non-theist or when I went to recovering from religion groups for counseling, the embrace of love and community there, it was a stark difference than what I ever experienced in a faith community.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm fascinated with Barna's research on the difference between Christian groups and non-Christian groups on moral criteria, and generally the Christian groups do less well than the non-Christian groups. If it's by their fruit you shall know them. It doesn't come out too good for the home team.
Interesting. I did see somebody share their video a second ago, and I wasn't sure who that was. If you have a question or comment, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello?
Quiet group.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hey.
Hi, this is Brian Force. I'm an old friend of Dale's.
Hey,
and
Brian.
I really enjoyed your talk, and heard you say some of these things in our prior conversations. And we're currently experiencing a collective threat to our enlightened existence, and you explain very well, I think, what's behind the slide. And I wonder, is it really relentless? Are there no guardrails? Are there no lessons to be learned, for example, from the Great Enlightenment? The Great Enlightenment occurred in the face of overwhelming resistance. And so we had a United States democracy founded on the principles of the Great Enlightenment. And we seem to be losing all of that, and we seem to be in a state of hopelessness about it, that there's really nothing we can do. And I wonder, and I don't know where you stand. Some of what you said sounds like there is a kind of an inevitability to this slippery slope that we're on. But I can't help but think that there is hope. I mean, in your own story, and in Darren's story, there was an enlightenment that occurred on the individual level. And I'm wondering, is there some way of spreading that out, of expanding that, of speaking to and against these forces that seem to be so relentless?
Well, Brian, I'll take a shot at that. I think even though you're always at risk of the double down, that education is our big weapon, and education in critical thinking, education in brain function, that part that I mentioned about thinking fast, thinking slow. It is very helpful to people to actually see what is going on in the brain that makes critical thinking so difficult. And if you could boil it down to one, well, it's hard to boil it down to one anything, but the lack of critical thinking is the greatest pandemic we have, certainly in our country. We are witnessing it. We are witnessing it as a plague. And this mechanism that I described, I wish this were part of every critical thinking class. It's not. People say, well, question your assumptions, but they don't get into the nitty gritty of why that's so damn difficult. And that's why I gave the example of road rage, because everybody understands that. But knowing how susceptible we are to that knee-jerk reaction of protection and buying into something that's crazy because we don't examine it. So I don't want to be pessimistic, but boy, I think there's solutions there. And education is the key. And we can't have superstars in education retire like Brian Forrest. We still need him we need him in the action. We need him on the field.
Well, I ain't dead yet, and I'm still working on a social conversion, but it ain't easy.
No.
Anyway, thank you for your insights here today.
Thanks for joining us, Brian.
And I'm noticing the time. We probably have time for one more question or comment if anybody has one. Otherwise, I can start closing out this session.
I wonder, might I make a comment?
Absolutely, please.
My name is Deborah Carmen, and I wanted to thank the moderator very much. Thank you. And Dale, as always, I'm just in thrall. My only comment, I'm not erudite enough to discuss anything academic or particularly profound on the subject, but I know a lot about Christianity because I was raised by my great-grandfather, and he was a Pentecostal preacher, and I was waterboarded Christianity as a child. And I think what I admire most in Dale, or what Dale gave me, one of the great gifts I've ever received, was the liberation to be free of the guilt that surrounded and just lived with me for so long that I felt I had been such an abject disappointment, and that I thought so contrary to what my great-grandfather's beliefs had been. And it was hellfire and brimstone and a punishing God, and it was terrifying as a child. And the psychological imprint that Dale refers to often was enormous for me. And I had a completely different trajectory in life. I like to share that I found my God in a bottle, and that was very liberating. But it's interesting to come to terms at this stage of my life to see incredibly bright minds, such as the two that are leading the meeting tonight, and Dale, of course, as our speaker. It's just really, it's wonderful material. And I share with you, Dale, because I have such a profound absence of any education in my life, that it's the greatest gift anyone can receive, is to have an enlightened education and to be a free thinker. And I want to thank you for liberating me and for being such a wonderful friend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deb.
Absolutely high praise. Well deserved. Well, that will be it for tonight. Again, thank you so much for doing this presentation, and to everybody who came out, thank you for supporting us. I do want to remind everybody, we have one more presentation. It's our final presentation of the two-day event, and it is in 35 minutes at the top of the hour. So I hope I'll see you back for one more round. And again, thank you so much, Dale, for everything you've done.
Thank you, Darren.
Give you the last word.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate everybody's being here and attention. And I would again urge everyone to consider the wonderful project Darren is promoting, the GoFundMe page for religious abuse. What's the term, Darren?
Religious trauma.
Religious trauma, a worthy cause. And I do hope you'll get the book, God and Horrendous Suffering. And the last chapter, you'll find much of the material we talked about today and more. I love being with you, and good night.
And one last thing you might want to know is that the Global Center for Religious Research has established the most comprehensive international research group to study the causes, manifestations, and treatment options for those suffering from religious trauma. But we have a big problem. See, in order for victims of religious trauma to receive help, we need to arrive at a place in our culture where religious trauma is recognized as a real mental health condition. And unfortunately, the academic study of religious trauma is still in its infancy. This means that there are no exhaustive empirical studies to support what we have seen and experienced, that religious trauma exists and is a chronic problem. As it stands, really only anecdotal case studies have been published so far, but nothing substantially empirical. And GCRR wants to correct this gap of knowledge, and we're hoping to get your help with that. So we have set up a GoFundMe page in order to crowdsource the world's very first, most comprehensive sociological study on the existence, causes, and manifestations of religious trauma. Now, the reason we are crowdsourcing this stuff is because we were actually set to get a grant, federal grant for this research project, and then the federal government halted all funding for mental health research. So we were left holding the bag. That's why we're hoping the public can join us in this effort. All you have to do is go to GoFundMe.com and search for the phrase religious trauma sociological study, or you can click the link that I'm going to put in the chat box. And at the very least, please share this GoFundMe page across all your social media platforms just to get the word out about this really important research project.